Carl, I think I saw you at One Barrel on Saturday during the block party. I was running in and out. I was grabbing my kid next door at Rocky Mountain Theater for Kid. I didn't get to say hello, but I was like, oh, wait, people that I've only seen virtually.
Yeah, we stopped in for a little refresher there. Didn't have anything to eat, but we go in there quite a bit. I was in there yesterday. No, today at noon. Yeah, yesterday. I'm sorry, yesterday at noon for lunch.
Great. I'll have to get your recommendations. I've been in there a couple of times, but I haven't eaten as much there either as I probably should. It's good food.
It is, yeah. It's some good food there. They're the wine, they sell the wine at a discount. The ones by the door there, they're cheaper than like Total Wine.
During COVID or during, when they were just doing takeout stuff, I definitely took advantage of their for sale specials that they had. There were some better prices than some of the local liquor stores.
They're going to continue doing that as long as the city allows them to do that. Selling out of the restaurant.
Yeah. Well, I don't think anybody on this call can make those decisions, but if anybody here does, we vote for letting them continue to do that.
Yeah, it's a council and city manager thing there. Not in my pay grade.
You mean our free pay grade?
You don't have to pay to come to these meetings?
No, yeah, that's right. I'm sorry, I forgot. I'm paying somebody.
Okay, hello everybody. We only have an hour tonight, so let's go ahead and get started. People might still trickle in here as we go for the next few minutes. We wanted to do two things this evening. The first is just give you an update on the housing grant that we talked about last meeting. If any of you weren't here last meeting, that the recordings and videos are online, so you can catch up and review those. And then the second thing we're going to talk about is we're going to dive into the first of the 5 high priority topics that came out of the assessment, and that is parking. And obviously, I don't think we'll cover everything tonight. We need to. It's just kind of an introductory session and get into some possible strategies to address with regards to housing. But before we get into that, I wanted to remind everybody that we are going to City Council next Monday night for a study session to talk about the innovative housing strategies planning grant that has been laid out through the Department of Local Affairs, DOLA. We talked about the 14 or so different strategies that the state has laid out to incentivize affordable housing through various methods with regard to different codes and that the community can utilize within the Unified Development Codes to incentivize. The first and other part of that grant is doing a community intensive housing needs assessment. So that will be part of the grant as well. At the end of the day, City Council can discuss and choose to push forward any one of those 14 strategies that the grant outlined. But we did land on 5 that we will recommend the council moving forward with as part of the grant. Keep in mind that as this is also wrapped into the Code Next project, we can include some of these other strategies outside of the grant. So there's a little bit of, strategy of our own that we can use. in terms of some of the items we think we're closer at achieving, and then maybe some of those others that we need to do more work on that we won't be tied up with the grant with. So the 5 that we're recommending moving forward with is 1, authorizing accessory dwelling units as used by right on parcels in single family zoning districts. We do have ADUs in certain single family zone districts already, but we'd like to see if we couldn't expand that into other areas of the community. Second is establishment of a density bonus program to increase the construction of units that meet critical housing needs in the local community. Typically, that is a scenario where we come up with a certain percentage of new units that must be meeting the definition of affordable. And then, requiring that as part of the overall development. Third is lessening the minimum parking requirements for new affordable housing developments. 4 is the use of vacant publicly owned real property within the local government for the development of affordable housing. As we talked about, DOLA has been given the authority to manage 3 different grants. This number 4 that I've read really plays into future grants that the city might wish to pursue, and that is actual construction projects. So if we have a strategy around the city's vacant publicly owned land, then we might be more successful in achieving the goals and grants for those future grants. And the 5th is creation of an expedited development review process for acquiring or repurposing underutilized commercial property that can be rezoned to include affordable housing units, and that includes the preservation of existing affordable housing units. And there are affordable housing properties around town, some in some older multifamily buildings and properties, and we'd like to not lose those. So this is maybe a strategy we can talk about during this grant review of how to preserve some of those existing units that we already have. And then there are also some commercial properties in the city that do not currently permit residential development other than through a PUD that have been looked at for redevelopment into housing. And so if there's a way we can strategize further on that recommendation, then I think getting the strategy in place now as part of this grant could be helpful moving into the future. So those are the 5 that we're recommending. Again, the others, as I said, can also be recommended. It's a city council decision at the end of the day. We are having the discussion with them on the 27th. So any of you are welcome to attend either virtually or in person. City council meetings are a hybrid scenario for in-person or virtual, and just see what city council has to say about this topic. I think regardless, it's going to help this committee in their discussions on housing, regardless of whether this grant is awarded to the city or not. So we'll get some early guidance, I think, from council on the topic. So we hope you can either tune in and watch or come in person and watch. It's your choice. Other than that, that's where we are. We're in the process of writing the grant now officially, and hope to have the grant submitted within the first week or 2 in October. So,
Wait, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Do we have to follow through with these, or these are the ones that we're going to investigate, right? There's no commitment to having to do any single one of these. We'll just have to. The ones we choose as part of the grant, we will have to make progress and incorporate in some fashion into our code. Yes.
So that's why we need to be strategic as to things, some of these that we're further along with, such as the ADUs, versus some that might take a little more work. So we want to make sure
like the 80, like I feel like the density program, the parking, those have kind of gone through. The ADU one is just such a topical conversation that tends to get a lot of emotions going. Mm-hmm. I don't think we have to do 5. Do we? I mean, I know we can consider that one. Do we want to commit to doing that one? I mean, I love the idea of it. I just know you say ADU and people get a little emotional.
Right. No, we have to do a minimum. We have to do 3. So that's one that could fall off if they feel that maybe that needs a little more time with it. So
I don't know if anybody else has any feelings on that. I would have a hard time saying that we're definitely going to go forward with that. I mean, I would love to see it. I just don't know that that's the case. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on that, or if this is not the time or place for that, then you can tell me that too.
Yeah, I mean, it's at the end of the day, council can choose not to do any of these or all 14 if they so choose. But yeah, they'll have to, and we'll stress this, they're going to have to understand that the grant will require some sort of implementation at the end of the day. So if they're feeling that this might be a heavier issue that the community might not be willing to yet accept, then I think that's what we'll have to decide with council.
I got a question on the amount of the grants. What is it, 1 grant or multiple grants, or what is the total amount?
There's 3 grants that have been established. There's only 1 grant currently open, and that is this Housing Strategies Planning Grant. And so there's about $7 million available during this first grant process. And of course, it'll be very competitive throughout the state with all of the other communities probably submitting some form as well. So this planning grant needs to be, I think the city needs this planning grant to figure out some of the other issues and questions through this housing needs assessment. If they are to go forward and ask for future funding for any kind of construction project and so forth. So this is the only one that's open right now. So that's where we're at.
Is there a limit on what Englewood can give? I mean, we can't get the whole 7 million.
No.
But is there a limit?
DOLA is expecting to make awards between $50,000 and $200,000 in terms of grants. The city must match 25%. So that's that.
All right, thank you.
Okay. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Chris then, and we'll talk about some of the parking issues and developments. So Chris.
Thanks, Wade. Good evening, everyone. I know we're on a time crunch for your regular meeting at the top of the hour. So as Wade mentioned, we have a brief presentation that just sort of frames the parking issue. I am aware that you all have discussed this a lot through the code assessment and through some of that engagement. There's a lot of good information that you've already uncovered. So this presentation is more of a refresher of a lot of that information and maybe add a few of our own thoughts of how this is going to play out over the course of this project. But again, discussing parking and what's the city's approach, policies, and ultimately regulatory goals with respect to parking in the development code. All right. Does everyone have my screen? Okay. One of the things we discussed with staff was sort of starting off with, what are all of the issues out there? This isn't a topic that it's a very hot topic, let's say, in the planning profession over the last 5 to 10 years. It's been drawing a lot of attention for a lot of different reasons. And so this list is some of those. It's probably not all, but it's our way of summarizing all of the things that are going to go into our thoughts on parking. So the first is sort of a shift in values of cities in general from the goal of trying to optimize parking to a period when cities first started regulating parking. It was trying to ensure that there was a minimum amount of parking, almost always free, on sites. Now that we've kind of spun through that cycle, cities are starting to realize too much might be as big a problem as too little. And so the idea of optimizing parking is certainly relevant and on people's minds as they revisit codes. The second thing influencing this is the idea of value and maximizing productive land and getting the most tax return on investment of that land. And this goes to a lot of thinking that's gone on over the past decade of assessing property for its value to the community, but also value to the city's bottom line. And it produces some pretty surprising results of, sites that are very well parked are consuming a lot of land as well. And so some of those actually become some of the least performing sites in your community. And it's shifting our frame of thinking of what are we trying to maximize as a city. Related to that is that the third angle, there's been lots of studies and documentation on how much parking costs, not only the physical cost of building it, the cost to developers, but then also the opportunity costs to the community as well. What are you losing by prioritizing parking? So that's influencing a lot of the thinking. Fourth is if we're building compact walkable places, and this is how it's pitched in a lot of your planning documents, is parking versus walkability. It's often juxtaposed as something that undermines walkability or perhaps our investment in transit as well, which is something very relevant to you all. And then the biking community as well. So how does parking fit into an overall mobility strategy that around compact places? Again, different than how we thought of parking in the past. The fifth one, there's environmental impacts. Documented heat island impacts are very relevant, and then also stormwater runoff can produce those negative impacts as well. So are there design strategies to mitigate some of those in addition to reducing the overall size and footprint? And then the last is one we just sort of lumped into technology. There's talk of what do driverless cars mean to our parking standards in the future and parking lots if we aren't storing as many cars or even storing cars at all. Lots of conversations in the planning profession of what that means to site design, but also street design and curb space and those types of things. But certainly there's also some shifts that technology is bringing from just how you manage parking, supply and demand type things that technology can influence. There's different transportation technologies from electric vehicles or smaller vehicles, everything from bikes, scooters to small electric vehicles that really shifts the amount of area that's needed for parking, and just general shifts in car sharing on demand, Uber, Lyft, those types of things that are sort of a version of the driverless car, even though they have drivers. But all of those things related to technology are shifting how parking is looked at. So that's sort of a really quick overview of the state of the profession and things that people are looking at and how our development codes need to change with regard to parking. An assessment of where you all are at, your development code. Again, the code assessment has a lot of details on this, but essentially we're not going to uncover anything that you haven't already talked about in your code in some way or another. There will be things that we want to push further. There will be things that we might want to look at a different way to accommodate the strategy. But you've seemed to have covered all of the things. Your minimum parking requirements are comparable to most communities, but again, most communities are coming from a suburban or car-oriented philosophy. And if you're shifting out of that, we probably need to look at what to do with those minimums. And there's certainly some analysis of peer communities in that regard that maybe have already addressed that we can lean on. Flexibility is a great strategy. The more flexible you can be with the standards, the better off you will be, at least in our mind. And the easiest way to get that in your code is through PUDs. That's not the only way, but it's certainly, there's room for more flexibility on the parking standards, I think. And if you recall back to our approach to flexibility in the development code as a whole, that's always a give and take. So we want flexibility, but we also want some criteria and expectations as well. So how we build that through parking will be important. You have exemptions, exempt areas. So the Broadway corridor being one, the MUB one zoning there doesn't require any parking. So part of your community is already deregulated in terms of parking. There's a lot of communities exploring that in a more expansive basis, more strategic basis, but some cities and some rather large cities have done it citywide, just for reduced minimum parking altogether. Allowing for more remote offsite parking. You currently have that in your code. It's mentioned in two places. In one place, it's no more than 300 feet. In another place, it's no more than 400 feet. So do we want to expand options for larger, more remote areas? TDM, that's transportation demand management. It's kind of a planning jargon term for looking at how people, if development can look at strategies that minimize car usage, then could they get a benefit on the parking? So you allow that and you allow sharing. It's just not necessarily the clearest path, although it does only require city manager approval. But building expectations, if we want to expand on that strategy, might be something to think about. You do require bicycle parking, but to us, it wasn't clear that would seem to be just in addition. There wasn't a benefit to the overall car parking footprint if you did that, unless we're missing something there. And then the last one is not really a development code issue, but it's showing that the city's thought about this, and the city uses a lot of these different strategies, but for those deregulated areas, mainly there's some spill-off impacts that can impact neighborhoods negatively. And so ensuring that they don't receive all the overflow parking, the neighborhood permit process that you currently have in place. And so are there things we need to do to either expand that, make that work better, or perhaps contract it if it's not working well? So again, your code and your policies are addressing all of those things. Just some quick facts on parking and why it matters. I'm sure you've maybe seen some of these numbers before. These are really rough general numbers, but they seem to play out in most communities. But I mentioned the cost earlier. About $8,000 for just the construction. Some are less, some are more. It is all tied to land costs, to be honest with you, not necessarily the capital facilities of parking, but it hits the developer's bottom line pretty hard when you think about the number of spaces that are required. And if you move to structured parking, obviously it hits it a lot harder. The number we always see about how much cars dictate our space with regard to people space is generally that a car has 8 parking spaces. Every car typically has 8 parking spaces available to it in a city. That space is anywhere from 300 to 350 square feet when you encounter the parking area and the circulation needed. That then leads to, in our commercial areas and mixed use areas, somewhere of 50% to 70% of land in a typical city is used for parking. And that one to me is kind of a shocking number when you think of it. But if you've done the Google Maps tour of places, it's about right. That's a good range, I think, of where we're at. And the last one is specific to you all. It came from a parking study that the RTD recently did. And what they found was that in and around their station areas, most uses were overparked anywhere from 42% to 50% of what they assessed as the peak demand. So that meant even at their highest use point, the parking provided was somewhere of, over a third to a half of a magnitude of more than what the parking needed. So that study is available on the Code Next website if you want to dive into it further and look at the findings. But those are some of the things we'll be looking at. Goals and objectives. This is sort of how we think about parking when we go to adjust regulations. We put the goals in 3 different categories, and all of them kind of work together, but these are areas where we can influence change and impacts to get us to the right amount of parking. No one wants a parking problem, but we also don't want to be losing other good things that come despite having parking. So first category, design, all of the things that are easy to regulate, things that we put a number to, things that we can measure, things that we can put criteria that are easy to evaluate. How much, where are you putting it, how large we can exert influence on larger or smaller lots, and then how it's designed to either be attractive or at least not have impacts on surrounding properties with landscape and screening. So all of those design categories that you currently have, we'll be revisiting those. The second category are things that we're really trying to achieve, things that aren't necessarily easy to put an exact number to, but these are the things that we would want to try to exert flexibility on whatever number we arrive at, that if you're achieving these things, then maybe the number could go down, but less visibility, less stormwater and heat island impact, lower costs, and increasing our opportunity costs for things besides parking that we can have, and then minimizing the impacts on neighborhoods. And then the last part that impacts parking is the first one, applicability. When does a parking standard trigger? That's going to have a huge impact for you all as a built out community, because we're talking about adaptive reuse, infill development. When do you have to meet the new standard if you're deficient? All of those things can impact a lot of how development occurs in the city. Second part of administration is that flexibility. If we're building in more flexibility to your code, who decides when and how easy is it to get to what people would agree is the right number? And then the last part, coordinating with other transportation investments. I know a lot of times development applications come with traffic impact studies or things that require transportation improvements, or they might be following along capital investments, and certainly one of the largest capital investments in your area are transit investments. So what does that mean to where and how we administer the parking standards? So I'm just going to tick through some of our options here, and give you examples of things that the code assessment already talked about, some things that maybe are a little bit new, and then I'll turn it over for discussion from you all, because again, I know you've all have thought about this probably a great deal for some of you. So first option is, do we reduce the minimum requirements? Do we bring them down generally throughout the city? Do we do it by offering more credits? Things for like counting on-street parking, or counting bicycle parking, or other types of credits towards things that are good, or options that can bring the required number down more than it already, where it may land at. Second thing is implement maximums. A lot of communities are doing this. There's several ways to think of it. First, some cities just convert their minimums to maximums. In other words, you're not providing any more parking than what our minimum used to be. There's some logic to that. I don't know if any of you have studied where the minimums come from, but a lot of times those numbers have come from an engineering report, the ITE transportation demand that studies suburban communities, studies them for their peak conditions, and then all of a sudden that number becomes the minimum parking standard, and then that kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that spirals up, because the more parking you have, the more driving you have, the more driving you have, the more parking you need. So there is some logic to just flipping it and saying those are no longer our minimums, they are our maximums, but it's certainly a fairly aggressive strategy. Some communities will set a minimum or a maximum above the percentage of the minimum, and then others would wade into that and say, well, we'll have a maximum, but maybe you could go over it if you mitigate by some other method of either design, giving us something that's a greater benefit than the extra parking you provided, or perhaps making it shared parking, or other things that have a larger community benefit if you're going over that maximum number. Third thing is expand specified exemptions. So I mentioned the Broadway corridor and the MU B1 zoning district. Are there other locations that need to be exempt from parking altogether? So that, in a sense, being more strategic about deregulating, unlike some of the cities that just said we're deregulating it citywide. So transit served locations would be the first place to look at. for either an eliminating or a reduced minimum parking. A lot of communities will look at uses under a certain size, that idea of promoting more small scale uses, and those are actually back to that cost number. Some of these smaller scale uses are the least able to absorb the cost. So there's some logic to that one. Are we looking at some exemptions if it's just a change of use or an adaptive reuse? So in other words, maximizing a current situation, but then not necessarily pinning you to a parking requirement, or not, at least not pinning you until it raises a certain critical mass threshold before you would put a parking standard in. So giving some flexibility to that number. Or if there's any other preferred uses, Wade mentioned on the grant, the affordable housing. Oftentimes, one of the strategies for that is to reduce the parking requirement, if not eliminate it. And again, there's data that shows those uses really do demand far less due to transportation habits, due to economic situations, due to car ownership. And then when you couple that with locating those areas in transit served locations, the parking goes even lower. And the RTD study points that out as well. So there's a parallel to that housing issue with some of these specified exemptions. Streamlining the shared parking. As I mentioned, you do have that in your code. I don't know how much it is used or how successful it's used. A lot of times those issues can become a little bit difficult to manage, but it's certainly something worth exploring more and figuring out if we can't get a better target. A lot of times what we'll do in development codes is, instead of just relying on some number that's out there, there are some models to use that take a range of uses with different peak times and kind of put them together in categories. The Urban Land Institute has a pretty good shared parking model that we could put in the code, and that's your starting point. So someone wouldn't necessarily have to go out and do an in-depth study if they were using that, or if they were using that and did a study anyway, they could use that to adjust from there. But it does create a starting point for people to kind of get the idea of how sharing could work or might work, even if you're not setting that as the standard. So again, promoting applicants to perhaps use their own data or specific studies if they have them too. I mentioned transportation demand management. So things that are really related to the user themselves, managing how people get there. So something as simple as valet parking or shuttle parking, finding an off-site location and then having no on-site parking. Stacked or tandem spaces. We see this a lot in multifamily or particularly larger scale multifamily. And if you're in a transit served area or a walkable area, this works really well. Or if you're targeted towards an aging population, this works really well. They may have a car, they may not need it all the time. And so this, when you think of that 300 to 350 square feet per parking space, when you start allowing stacked or tandem spaces to count, where someone could, call down to a desk and get a car moved and get their car out. It may take 5 or 10 minutes to do that, but that can actually double the amount of parking you can get in a single area just by that simple strategy alone. And similar multifamily, a lot of multifamily projects are doing what they call unbundled parking. That's one that usually requires the city to mandate it, because the way it works is it forces you to sell your parking different from your residential unit, so that there's a price put on it, and then the developers can figure out how much or how little they want to build based on that price point. So someone could rent a unit absent the parking requirement is really the goal there. It can bring housing costs down by letting people pick and choose how much of the amenity they want. Do I want a unit? Do I want a unit with 1 parking space? Do I want a unit with 2? And then there can also be different classes of parking spaces in that strategy as well, whether it's a outdoor lot versus an indoor lot, or whether it's a fully accessible space or one of those stacked or on-demand spaces. So there can be all kinds of layers of price points with that strategy. And then just a bunch, related to transit or carpool programs or anything like that, those are what your code currently would accept, to be honest with you, but it's just open as to someone bringing that and proposing it through that, the provision that's in your current code now. And then the last part I mentioned, increasing the administrative flexibility. So is there some level of parking flexibility that staff can just become the arbiter of, and through the simple permit process, you can do some reductions if it meets certain criteria? I know the RFP talks about building this into the code through alternative compliance in a number of ways, not just parking, but things that are more flexible decision-making points. And then is there a certain threshold that's above that that would be in the planning commission's court if it was too large of an alternative and you need to grant an exception? But again, something that's short of a variance, that's getting to the tiers of flexibility that we want to try and build into your code. And so on all of these, what we're listening for is, where is the community at? On each of these strategies, there's everything that ranges from really significant changes to things that we can do to just improve what you're already doing, and things in between there. So that's what we're going to be listening for throughout the process. And just one last thought on how we think about parking. This isn't necessarily the city's policy or the city's goals, but it's what we will be bringing to the table. Is the first is that shifting role of the city. We do not want to set ourselves up to ensure that we're going to have, we want the code to make sure everyone has parking. That's really not the goal of the code, because there will be so many other things that we're trying to prioritize that in some cases, in some contexts, maybe parking isn't our number one goal or objective. Maybe other things are. In other parts of the community, that might be true, but we can use the code and the comprehensive plan to kind of filter those out. But we don't want to set ourselves up for saying that the development code is always going to make parking free and convenient. The other part is educate stakeholders that, most communities always have a parking problem. And sometimes, some places that's a good problem to have. You want a parking problem, and other places it's not. But the idea that you have too much parking is also equally a problem, because you're usually sacrificing something good or better that your community wants. So we need to put that in perspective and make sure everyone's talking about the ideas in the big picture sense, and not in a personal experience or a narrow sector of your community when we talk about parking problems. And then the last part is not expecting the code to give us the right answer. It will not. These numbers are fuzzy at best. There's a lot of factors that go into it, but what the code can do is become a really good decision-making tool for how we try to get to the right parking number, that optimal number. But it won't spit out a magic number that says we need this much parking in this situation. There's simply no way to really codify that, but we do want to start thinking through the issues in the big picture and starting to put flexibility and criteria in where it's warranted and needed. So with that, I think I'll just go back to this last slide and turn it all over to you for questions, observations, discussion points.
Judy, I see your hand.
There's two things that sort of are my biggest issue when it comes to parking, and everybody's going to have their thing. And you put in the design objectives about the location, and the 50, I think it was 50 to 70% of a city is taken up with parking. And I think one of the biggest issues, at least from my view, is that it's because the parking isn't in the right place. And so all the parking in the world in the wrong place might as well not exist. So I agree, it wastes land, but it needs to be in the right place. When they were talking about city center, we kept bringing up all the RTD parking, and so I will disagree with one comment that you said we needed to change our thinking. I'm not sure you'll be able to convince me is it needs to be convenient. I don't think it has to necessarily be free, but it has to be convenient. The second thing that has really been weighing on me lately is we talk about reducing parking as if that's going to magically make our community walkable. And I really wish that we would focus on making our community walkable before we started taking away all the parking. And I know, but I feel like we're getting the cart before the horse. You can't walk down Broadway. The sidewalks aren't wide enough. They're not in good repair. They've done a lot of good things in the neighborhoods with curb cuts and stuff, but I've made this issue before. If you're walking with two people or a mom and a stroller, you have to walk in the street because our sidewalks aren't wide enough. So before we start, you can ask people, they're not going to walk from the south side of Hampton to downtown Broadway because there's no safe way to do it. So they're going to drive. I mean, I just think that I'm going to harp on this walkability thing because we talk about it, and we're going to talk about the walk and wheel in our next part of our meeting. But until it's actually walkable, you're going to be hard pressed to convince me that we're going to start taking away parking, because that doesn't magically fix the walkability problem. So that's my opinion. I'm pretty strong on that as well.
No, thank you. Those are good points.
Colin?
And we're not talking about reducing parking requirements everywhere in the city. These are in certain areas, right, that we were talking about in that MUB1 or in the PUD, or are you talking about a global?
I think we're probably not even there to know which one. I think they're all on the table, but I certainly think a refined strategy is that's what we recommend for most cities, is that it's not a one size fits all anywhere. And to the points that were just made before, I think even to the convenient point very well taken, by the way. But what's convenient and what's not is often a perception of that walkability. I'll give you like an anecdote I have is the neighborhood I live in. We have a small mid-sized grocery store that has a smaller parking lot, lots of on-street parking, and some of my friends who come to my neighborhood are like, oh, I wouldn't go to that grocery store. There's no parking. When you count all the on-street parking that's within a block, and some of that's much closer than even the furthest parking spot in a suburban parking space, those spaces are all actually closer. And in fact, you get some spaces that are within 10 feet of the door, which you would never get in a suburban spot. So there's like the having it be in the right location is so crucial. And oftentimes you hear that it's not so much that you have to get that spot, but that the fact that that spot's available draws people there. You may not get it, but then there needs to be, okay, where's my second spot? Where's my third spot? And then, to the point, only perhaps the most remote and on a bad day you get that spot. Those are the ones that don't have to be super convenient, but your point of that they all need to be convenient is true. And so a roundabout, getting back to the original question, is those are all highly context driven. So the right solution on Broadway probably isn't going to be the right solution over off of 85 or somewhere like that. So we will certainly look at that, and we'll steer this to wherever we're directed, but we're starting to get a sense for some of the issues that have come up in the past and what that might mean for the code.
Michelle?
Yeah, I would also caution drastic changes in parking because there's two developments that I can think of off the top of my head where a city or somebody approved, well, in one case on Santa Fe Drive and Mineral, I think that the developer there wanted to do, it was going to be a shopping center, and the city of Littleton was insistent that they provide underground parking, and it just wasn't going to work. The numbers weren't going to work. And so the developer said goodbye, and that lot is now still vacant. The other example is if you can think about on the northeast side of I-25 in Hampton, there's a small development there that has vastly not enough parking. And as a consequence, several tenants just have left, and now there's actually just some vacancies. And there used to be a Smash Burger there, and now that's closed. There used to be some sort of a pizza place, and that closed. And it's just a matter of it just doesn't, we might want to try and change the world, but if the world's not changing with us, then it's not going to work. Uh-oh, I can't hear anybody.
I kind of agree with Judy on a lot of the points she made there. The UDC, in my opinion, is a guideline. It's not made to force a way of living on the people that live under the UDC. It's a guideline for when you want to build something or change something. It just controls what you do. It's if you want to build a 10-story parking garage, well, it's going to limit how you do something. The changes that are done to the UDC need to be minimal as far as I'm concerned. We're not trying to change the world by changing our UDC to eliminate cars. We can't do that. We're not going to do that. The less cars, the better, sure. There's less smog and the less traffic and the less accidents. But cars have been around for decades, and they're going to be around for decades and decades more, whether they have drivers in them or not. They're going to be around, and we need to have places for them. If we got too much parking, we'll tear up some of the parking and plant some trees in there, put a park in there. And I don't want to go with the way Denver is, and it's to go downtown, you got to pay $20, $25 to park for a couple of hours. I don't want that. I'm not going to go to Englewood if it happens like that. So we just need to not try to change the world by changing the UDC so that it controls the parking in there. There's really no big changes that need to be done to it. It could be modified, sure. Do a few changes here and there, but I just don't see any big changes that are really needed. And I don't want to change our parking. We've got over 1,000 spaces out there that can be used for something. And the city wants to put apartments in there. Well, I don't really agree with that either. So, but the parking is, there's spots in Englewood that are hard to park. You go downtown and you can't park on the main street, the 3400 block, pretty much any time of the day. There's very little parking on the street. You got to go behind the street and on both sides of the west of it and east of it to park. So the changes we make need to be looked at, and they need to be minimal as far as I'm concerned.
Andy, and then Colin.
I was just going to add, I think we're talking a lot about retail, restaurants, those kind of things. I think we're always going to struggle with parking for those, but I did like some of this about specifying certain exemptions where just whether it's the context when we're talking about residential, I think we've done a lot through PUDs to bring some of the parking requirements down. I think just trying to make more projects feasible, especially more affordable, having parking requirements can really help with that. And then I also think some of what I saw about maybe some of the smaller retail or commercial spaces, it could really encourage a lot more adaptive and creative use along Broadway. There's a lot of opportunities that just aren't feasible now because you can't park the site and there's no room to expand. There's just not that opportunity. And so just to see some of those opportunities become more feasible with just a little bit more specified exemptions would be great to see.
Colin, and then Christine.
Yeah, and I'm going to disagree slightly with Michelle and Judy, and I totally respect your guys' opinions. I just feel a little differently about it. We can't take anecdotal information from I-25 and Hamden. That's not next to a light rail. That's not next to some of those places that might have been impacted by many other things. Just like I don't necessarily love the parking study that was done in the middle of COVID either. I wish there was a different study that was done that was maybe a little more applicable and a little better to be done. But I do think that we do have the opportunity to help enforce change and actually help implement some of these changes and get people to think outside of just having a car. And Carl, you actually said it, you're like, whether there's a driver in it or not, that is actually happening, that is coming, and that's going to be here before we realize it. And there are going to be driverless shuttles that are going to be able to take people from maybe a parking lot that is a little further away and bring them into some of these more densely populated areas where people want to be. And so I think we need to set some of these minimums that don't make it too overly restrictive for development to happen. And we need to be able to embrace some of these changes that are going to make our city a dynamic place to be. We can't be a car-based place that's so spread out that you don't have a vibrant area. The reason why downtown Broadway is awesome in the 3400 block is because it is a little hard to find parking, because people want to be down there and there's a density down there and there's an excitement down there when you have a block party like you had last weekend. And so we got to be able to look forward to these things. And, you know, it's not going to happen overnight, and maybe we're going to make a misstep or two, but I think we have to try to push forward into making what Inglewood has the opportunity to be, which is a great city, even better than what it is right now, which is pretty awesome.
Christine?
Thanks. I had some thoughts to build on what Colin was saying. I'm in favor of taking the opportunity we have here to take a fresh look and design the community that we want to have both now and in the future. In general, I'm in favor of reducing the asphalt hellscape, and we have a lot of that throughout our town. Yeah, some places might have too few spaces, but a lot have too many. And no one wants to walk through parking lot land. It's just so unpleasant. So in general, I think we probably have too much parking. I'd be in favor of taking a look at reducing the parking minimums or implementing some maximums or some combination thereof. And yeah, I thought the 3400 block was a good example, because if we had huge parking lots for those businesses on the 3400 block instead of behind it, it wouldn't be the charming Main Street that we all love. It would have a totally different feel, more of just a regular suburban big box kind of feel. So if we take a look at parking minimums and maximums, I think that's a good approach. And we could do some tweaking too. It looked like some of the old standards were based on square footage of the building, maybe, and some were based on occupancy. Maybe more of those should be based on occupancy instead of square footage, because we really want to design the parking amount for the people that are going to be there, not just how big the actual building is. I'd like if we could add some more trees. I think landscaping is in there a little bit, but the difference between a tree and a bush, especially in the hot summer when you're trying to find a parking space, the only the spaces that get taken are the ones under the trees, and there's only usually like one of those. So I would like to add a lot more trees if possible, or work that into the number of parking spaces. And then I've seen some designs both in our existing city and in other planning and zoning where the parking lot is either alongside the building or kind of integrated into it. So it's not just all you see from the streetscape. So there could be some places like that, not for the whole city, but for certain neighborhoods where that might be more appropriate. I saw an example in that in Lakewood's planning. And then the last comment, having said that, I don't want to count on just overflow to the street, because people start to think that almost it's their right to park there. Whereas I kind of think street should be to move people, not just to park your stuff there. So the more on-street parking we have, the harder it gets to ride your bicycle down there, because you are squeezed between cars that are going 40 miles an hour and parked cars that then open their doors at any time. It's a death trap, and it is so scary, and you're not allowed to bike on the sidewalk. So what the heck are you supposed to do? So I don't want to just force more people onto using on-street parking either. Sorry, that was a whole lot of thoughts, but some of what's on my mind.
And then we have Kate Fuller, and this will probably be our as much time as we have left. Kate?
Just to echo on what Colin and Christine were adding, I just wrote down a few notes to add on to that kind of sentiment. If we can reduce the minimum for parking, we can leave the decision up to the developer. Because when they're building their projects, they're not going to want to put a bunch of money into parking if they don't think that's what their end user is going to want. That would hurt their business. So they're always going to do their own parking studies to make sure that they have adequate parking to attract the people they want to live there or work there or rent the space for retail or whatever it is. So if we can lower the minimum, we won't have a minimum that's too high. And then we'll still, the developers, it'll be up to them to decide to have enough parking for what they need. And then also I wrote down that, sorry, I kind of wrote a few things about that and then just talked about it. Also near Hobby Lobby is an example of just they have layers and layers and layers of parking. And I just always laugh about what scenario would they ever fill that parking lot up? And I can walk over there, but walking from, I live near Discount Tire, walking from there to the library can just feel so weird, walking through all these big parking lots, big box stores, just to go from my neighborhood to my library. It feels like I'm going through, Christine mentioned, the suburbs, and it's kind of like a ghost town. They're not very busy. So I just feel whatever we have now is too much parking. Maybe that, my opinion, would change if we had more activated retail spaces or restaurants over there. But for now, it's just making the whole neighborhood hotter because there's so much more cement. It's just not really adding to the tapestry of our culture in Inglewood. And then also, I liked what Christine said about not wanting us to be too suburban, and we don't want to lose our character. So if we just imagined, like you said, Broadway with a bunch of cars, well, I guess not Broadway, but you know what I mean? That would take away from the tapestry of what our community is going for and how, I don't know, the character of our buildings is really what I want us to be focusing on. And a thing I really do want to keep in mind, I think something that's really important for parking is accessibility for people that can't walk or people with wheelchairs. So making sure that we do have those designated spaces for them because those are the people. And I think someone has mentioned too, children or parents with strollers. I don't know how we meet that specific need and not discriminate against other people, but that is something I've heard from the community. But I could see us having more activated green spaces and pocket parks throughout. If anyone's heard of a pocket park, I feel like I've heard that more and more lately.
Okay, Chris, so we are coming to the end of our hour. Advice for the next meeting, just continuing on this conversation, I guess, or how would you like to?
Well, we'll try and sum it up with our notes. There's a lot of good thoughts that are spurring other ideas that I think we're tracking through here. So we'll try and connect the dots on a lot of these comments, and it's clear people have thought about this.
Yeah,
which is good. It's a good thing.
Right. Okay. Planning Commission members, you will have to leave this meeting and join the other meeting via the other link that you were sent. And other than that, thank you all, and we will see you on the 4th.
Good night. Thanks, everyone.